Good morning, everybody. It's the 27th of September, 2023. You can hear my little girl bird. Where is she? There she is, my almost constant companion. So, this is part 3 of the series I'm doing of self-disclosure. What I would like to do this morning is talk about my forefathers on my mother's side. I remember my great-grandmother. I did not know her husband, but I know some things about him. My great-grandmother actually was, I think she was in her late 80s, early 90s, when I was about I'm going to say 8 years old, and everything I did as a little kid at that time, she had something negative to say about it. And I realized when I was thinking about doing this particular video that what that grumpy old lady taught me was shame, because she always shamed me. And I never realized that until I started thinking about doing this video. So, yeah, shame. It doesn't leave a person easily. I'm still working on that, but I've mostly cleaned that drawer out. Her husband, however, I never knew Granny's first name. We always called her Grandma Ferguson. Her husband, my great-grandfather, if he was still alive when I was an infant, I don't remember. But I saw photographs of him. He was kind of built like a Humpty Dumpty, but he was affected very badly by polio as a young man. So, the photographs I have of him, I think they're still floating around somewhere. He always walked with a cane, and because he was quite severely disabled, he earned a living by being a Raleigh salesman. And I'm the last one in the family that would have any remembrance of any of this. But I think he and great-granny Ferguson lived with Grandma and Grandpa Hartt at their homestead in Hanna, Alberta. I never remember not having great-grandma Ferguson in my life until she passed away, of course. So Grandpa Ferguson, like I said, earned his living by having a Raleigh route. And we're talking in the days before automobiles. So his route took him 3 months to complete. And he had what I'm going to call a skid shack. It was like a little house that in the summer he could put on a big wagon frame, and in the winter it went on a sleigh, big heavy industrial sleigh, and he could sit inside and drive from inside. He had his little pot-bellied heating stove in there that he could cook on and heat with, and he also had all his supplies in there. And he, of course, became very close to his team of horses. And I've been trying to remember the name of that pair of horses, and I don't. They were light draft horses. I imagine that rig was a pretty hard pull. Anyway, he did that 12 months of the year. And one winter, he had a breakdown with the sled. it had big, wide metal skids on the bottom of the four sets of sleighs, and it somehow broke. I never, if I was told what really happened, I don't remember. And so he was quite some distance from his next customer. And this man always walked with a cane, and he couldn't walk without his cane. So what he did was he unhooked his horses, and he put a hand, an arm, over each of the hames. The hames are the metal pieces that go on either side of the collar on the harnesses, and he let his team take him to the next destination. And that team had been doing that route for years. And so they knew exactly where they were going. And he was almost dead by the time they got him to the next house. It was probably somewhere between 20 and 30 below Fahrenheit. And so he was almost frozen. And I think after that, he probably had to give his route up. Anyway, that was my great-grandfather, Ferguson. And that's about all I know of him. But their daughter, my grandmother, was born in Helena, Montana. And she had a brother and a sister, and I knew both of them. I was still, I was about 10 when the brother died. He was well liked by the adults, but he was a miserable so-and-so to his son. It was back in the days when people thought you could beat a kid up to get them to learn something, rather than realize that they might have a learning disability or that they really didn't understand the theory. And if somebody had just taken the time to sit down and explain that, the kid might have got the message. I also suffered from that particular adult thing with my dad. Anyway, I remember Grandma Hartt's sister quite well. I was probably maybe 12 when she passed away. She used to come and spend the winters with us because she and her husband had homesteaded up in the Peace River area, and they didn't do well as homesteaders, and her husband wouldn't leave the place, but she couldn't handle it. She just couldn't handle it, and she would come down every winter and spend the winter with us. So anyway, now I come to Grandma Hartt. Grandpa Hartt used to run 15 miles one way to court my grandmother. Her maiden name was Ferguson, of course, and her first name was Lillian, and she must have been quite the woman. So he would run 15 miles one way to spend an hour or two with her, and I'm not sure where that happened. I know they moved from Helena, Montana to I want to say Blackie, which is in southeast, central east Alberta. I've never been to Blackie. Anyway, they got married, and they moved to their homestead by horse and buggy in 1917. So I looked this up yesterday because that was kind of right in the middle, early to middle stages of World War One. And my grandpa Hartt was a millwright and a machinist. But I'll talk about him later. Um, Grandma Hartt, when I knew her, because Mom and I used to go out to their place every summer to help with all the haying and chores and stuff. She had three boys and my mom. So she basically kept a family in groceries during the dirty 30s, and she did that by raising chickens and selling the eggs. And she milked 18 head of cows by hand twice a day. And she saved the cream. And I remember the little guy that used to come and pick up the cream. And when we're talking cream, we're talking sweet cream that was so thick that you could stand a big long wooden spoon up in it. And she saved it in those old metal milk containers, and they were submerged in the well house into the water because they had an artesian well, and it ran constantly, and so it was like a refrigerator. So she was quite the gal. She really was, and I grew up on stories about her, and I'll tell you a couple of them. She was a tremendous horsewoman and cattlewoman. My grandfather that was not his forte. That's the kind of thing I can say about it. But she could ride, and they had, when I was there as a very young child, they had about 200 head of range beef cattle, and so they always had a bull. And this story I'm about to tell you is from my mom's early childhood memories. So it was before they turned the beef cattle out onto the community pasture, and the bull was in the yard, and he had gone on a rampage. Now, if you've ever been around a bull or a stallion that gets their hormones up and they get ugly and nasty, I'm gonna cough, just give me a sec. So this bull ran off, and he went about 3 or 4 miles to the closest neighbor, and he was ready to do some damage. And the fellow, and that family's name was Blacks, and Mr. Black got the bull in a pen, and they did have telephone at that time, and I can tell you another story about their telephone. Anyway, he called Grandma Hartt, who happened to be in the house, and he said, "You better go out in the field and get Carl," my grandpa's name, and whoever else is there, and come and get this bull because he's on a rampage." And Grandma Hartt says, they'll be useless to do anything about that. So they always had 2 working stock horses, and one would be out in the pasture for a couple of weeks and there was water out there. The other one would be in the barn in case they needed a saddle horse. So, and because their property was the end of the provincial telephone line, but there were people that were out beyond them that were also homesteaders. And so what they did was they used the top line of their barbed wire fencing as a telephone line. It didn't work very well, but it did work unless somebody forgot to close the gate. So they always had telephone wire, number 9 telephone cable hanging around the place for repairs. So she went out and she cut herself a piece of fence post, and we're talking diamond willow fence post. I have a cane here that's made of diamond willow, and it would have been about the size of a man's thumb, but it's hard wood. So she cut herself a chunk of that, probably about 2 feet long, and she drilled a hole in the end of it because they had their own blacksmith shop and ability to do that. And then she tied a chunk of this number 9 telephone wire onto that. Went saddled up the saddle horse and pitter-pattered over to the neighbors. And this bull was trying to take the fence down. So the farmer had a pitchfork, probably a 3-time bundle fork, and he was busy keeping that bull in that pen. So when he saw Granny come with the saddle horse, he thought this is not going to end well. And she said, "You just never mind. You open that GD gate and get the heck out of the way." So he did, and she went in there and she started whipping on that bull and got him out of the pen. And she ran that bull home as fast as he could go, whipping him all the way. So when Mom got home, they had a community 1-room school, and they had an old retired draft horse that Mom used to have, again, hooked up to a wagon when the weather would permit, and a sleigh when it didn't. And she would drive her brother and the school teacher and what do you call those cans that they used to put the milk and the water in? Anyway, she would drive and she picked up kids along the way. And where was I? Oh, Mom had come home from school, put the rig away, and noticed the bull standing in the yard. Now, in those days, you didn't screw around with those bulls. They were kind of half wild and more than half mean. But she noticed that bull was standing there really quiet, and she went up and she said, "You couldn't lay 2 fingers together anywhere on that bull's hide and not have a whip mark on it." And she said after that, that bull was the most peaceful, gentle bull you ever saw. But also, the Granny Hartt carried her arm in a sling for a couple of weeks. So that was one of Granny Hart's stories. And then another one was she had a team of light driving horses that she would hook to a light, what did they call those things? The name just went out of my head. Anyway, put it in, hooked them up to a light driving carriage. The name, it'll come to me in a minute. It's a single seat, bench seat with storage behind it. Anyway, she would hook them up. They were 24 miles from town. She would drive to town in an hour. She could get her shopping and whatever parts were needed, if that's why she went into town, or whatever supplies she needed. And she could usually get that done in an hour and then turn around and come back in an hour. And her team's names were Toots and Lulabelle. And one of them was a trotter and the other one was an Arab cross. So when you stop and think, I mean, people say, well, 25-mile endurance ride is, that's where you start. In 50-mile, you're kind of getting, up there. Well, Granny Hartt considered that to be quite normal, and she could do a 3-hour home to the local town, Hannah, and back in 3 hours, and then make supper for her family, milk the cows, and do the churning of the milk to get the cream, collect the eggs, and do all that, and then go to bed and get up at crack of dawn the next morning and do it all over again. So one time a neighbor, her big old draft horse, which was a heavy draft horse, had gone lame, and so she called Granny and asked if she could go to town with her. So Granny's on her way to town, and the woman is terrified because she never drove her horse out of a walk, and Granny's, clipping along 24 miles to town. You're not walking, let's put it that way. And the woman was terrified. She said she'd never ride with Granny Hartt again, and Granny considered it perfectly normal. That same woman, sometime later, was driving her old heavy draft to town, and we're talking a narrow 2-track road here, right, on the Bald Head Prairies. So this lady was quite determined, because Granny caught up to her. This lady was quite determined that she was going to make sure that Granny drove safely. And so when Granny went to pass her, the gal blocked her, pulled out in her way. So Granny went the other way, and she blocked her that way too. So what Granny did, and we all know this trick, is she pulled over one way, the woman blocked her, pulled over the other way, blocked her. So she did that a couple of times, and then boom, she just went out and around her and was gone. And then the gal went, did her shopping, and got home, and it took her all day to do that. And so one time my grandpa was in town because he hauled grain. They also were wheat farmers, and that was his main cash crop. And so he would drive into town with his sleigh in the wintertime and stay overnight and then drive back the next morning. He had a 4-horse hitch. And this gal's husband happened to be in town and caught up with Grandpa Hartt, and he said, you should maybe get a bit of a handle on your wife, because one day she's going to kill herself driving like that. And I remember sitting at the big dining room table in the evening at dinner time and hear Grandpa tell that story, and he knew Grandma Hartt was completely safe with her team. And what the hell did they call that wagon? It'll come to me when I don't need it. Anyway, he laughed. He was so proud of Granny and her driving abilities. So anyway, I've been flapping my bottom jaw for just about 24 minutes here. So I'll shut up and download this on YouTube, and I'll come back with some more crazy stories. Love you all. Take care. Bye for now.